Or the U.S. government has basically maxed out its credit card.
Where the U.S. will default on its debt for the first time in history.
Or raise that $31 trillion debt limit.
So the clock is now ticking to raise the debt limit or risk economic catastrophe.
We've seen all over the news that the US has reached its debt limit and could be on the brink of defaulting. But you may be thinking, how have we reached this point? Or is this really as dangerous as the media tells us? In this video, we'll go all the way back to examine all of the potential causes.
And what you can see here is, look, that's 2020. That's the year we're in at the moment, and it goes all the way down to 11.3% contraction.
It shows just how the country's virus lockdown has hit jobs there.
Mom and pop shops, as you know, were especially hard hit and are struggling to stay afloat amidst the pandemic.
COVID wreaked havoc on the economy. With everyone locked down, firms had no workers, so they couldn't operate properly. While workers had no income, so they couldn't afford to purchase goods. End of the world, right? Luckily, the Fed had a perfect solution. The correct name for this is quantitative easing, where the Fed creates money to buy government bonds, which increases the money supply. As well as monetary policy, huge fiscal packages were approved in the form of stimulus checks. So basically, the end result is everyone has a lot more money to spend, and firms can invest for incredibly cheap, as the interest rates for loans are very low. This created a huge economic boom, with the stock market reaching all-time highs and an insane mania phase of cryptocurrencies. Everyone is happy, but what they don't realise is that there is a cost to this. First, in order to fund these huge stimulus packages, the government has to borrow. When borrowing exceeds taxes, the government runs a budget deficit. This puts the government in high levels of debt. This is extremely important, and we will return to it. So for now, remember that high debt equals very bad. Normally, debt is a useful tool for boosting economic growth, as it allows governments to spend money on society, such as policing, social programs, or if you live in the UK, healthcare, while not ripping you off with insane taxes. So, the economy doesn't look too bad at this point. Sure, the debt is rising, but growth is healthy, and your favourite altcoin is reaching the moon. This brings us nicely to the war in Ukraine and to the real cause of the recession: inflation. While some believe that Russia only started this war to push back on NATO's expansion, I believe that they knew exactly how important they were to the oil and gas market, and that sanctions would come flooding in the moment they stepped a toe over the Ukrainian border, leading to the skyrocketing inflation rates we see today. Russia is one of the world's leading exporters in oil and gas, and Europe has always relied on this. For example, Russia accounted for 55% of Germany's natural gas imports in 2021. So, when sanctions were imposed on Russia, which by the way is a better solution than nuclear war, they simply decreased the supply of their exports to the countries that sanctioned them, which massively increased the prices of gas and oil. These markets are pivotal to the world, as everyone needs these resources for everyday use. Skyrocketing prices pushed overall inflation up and up and up, peaking to 9.1% in June 2022. Inflation has perhaps single-handedly caused this recession. Here's why. When inflation is high, it costs more for people to buy the products they need, while their wages don't keep up at the same rate. This causes strikes and political pressure, as the cost of living problem becomes a cost of living crisis. The best way to reduce inflation is to reduce the amount of money or liquidity in the economy. This is done with a tightening monetary policy, which is the exact opposite of what was seen during the pandemic. It reduces the money supply to increase interest rates. This makes borrowing more expensive, discouraging investment from firms, and encouraging saving from the public. This slows down the economy, reducing the amount of transactions using money, so reducing the price level of money products. Because high interest rates have a negative effect on investment and spending, economic growth slows down. GDP is the amount of goods and services sold in an economy over a year. If it is negative for 2 quarters or 6 months in a row, a recession is declared. Recessions are as bad as they sound. They lead to high unemployment and decreased living standards across the country. They indicate that businesses aren't performing well, so their profits decrease, meaning they have to lay off staff in order to survive. With more people without a job, there's a cycle of less work, less spending, and continued negative growth, leading to very tough times, especially for the poor. There is a much more dangerous aspect to this particular recession, what I touched on earlier, involving the levels of government debt. High debt mixed with recessionary conditions is the worst possible combination for an economy. because it creates a vicious cycle that could lead to a complete collapse of capitalism and reset of the world as we know it. Studies have found that if public debt exceeds around 80% of GDP, economic growth is negatively impacted. At the time of writing, the debt to GDP ratio in the USA is around 122%. That means that government debt, which is currently $31 trillion, is much more than what the entire economy is producing in a year. The US has recently reached this debt ceiling, raising fears of the government defaulting on its debt. Now, the government can just do what it always does, raise their debt ceiling. However, repeating this process becomes more difficult when interest rates are also increasing. If lenders start to worry about the US's ability to repay its debt, they could ask for a higher interest rate to compensate on the higher risk of default. So increasing interest rates now makes it even harder for the government to stabilise debt. And now, there's no way to reverse this damage. The only way to pay off debt now is to increase taxes or reduce spending, which contributes to a recession. This cycle of higher interest rates, inability to pay debt, fears of default, and a deeper recession just worsens the economic conditions and puts the government in an impossible situation. We are currently approaching this stage. The US debt system is the greatest Ponzi scheme the world has ever seen. So, what happens now? Cannot predict the future with 100% certainty. This is just one of the many scenarios that could play out, but it makes sense based on economic theory and history. Default is actually illegal under the 14th Amendment. But if the US has no option but to default, it will cause a collapse not seen since the Great Depression of 1929. The scary thing is, we won't know exactly how bad it is until it happens. One main crutch to this argument is that it relies on a fairly deep recession to exacerbate the vicious debt cycle. It seems that the Fed is effectively bringing down inflation, which could end the recession sooner than expected. We are also seeing a strong labour market, with low unemployment indicating that we are not yet seeing the effects of a bad recession. So, to summarise, interest rates go down because of quantitative easing. War causes inflation. We need interest rates to be high to stop inflation, but high interest rates cause recessions. In this recession, the risk of US government debt default increases. One thing is for certain, Russia would be laughing because of the actions that most countries took against them in response to their invasion, which has directly caused this crisis. This could become a global problem. As the USA is still the global superpower, this collapse will negatively affect the whole world, including Russia and China. But with China's economy on course to surpass the USA's in the near future, this could be the catalyst that starts a change in world order.
All of these five coming together. I think we're going to go through, like, it'll be almost like a time warp that we're going to go through, that over the next 5 to 10 years, the world is going to be very, very different than it is today.